otherwise, I'm okay with the stream.
And Ruben speaking second, he or they, and I also consent to the stream.
Great, thanks. And finally, Siol.
Lior speaking first, no preference, I consent.
And Tamar speaking second, no preference, and I consent to this stream.
Okay, so thank you everyone. Good luck. And without any further ado, we are very proud to call upon our Prime Minister.
Thanks. All right. In my speech, first, I'm going to talk about what this looks like. Second of all, why we think this is the most effective way to spend money and why right now that isn't being done in the status quo. Third of all, why this shows the public that money is being spent in a good way, which means that more people within the public are likely to spend money on development aid, which means that more money in total is going towards development aid. So first of all, what does this look like? So we think that a few caveats about this, right? First of all, this is about relative gains as well as absolute gains, right? So it's not just like, where do we have the most absolute amount of utilitarian value, but also what places are the most effective, right? So is there a relative amount of improvement in an area or not? Second of all, we say this is about what method works well, right? So it's not like if in some area a method isn't working well, we say, fuck that area, we're moving on to a different one. But we say, we simply try a sort of approach. If that approach doesn't work, we try a different approach, right? So we're still using a need-based model, going to the areas that need help the most. However, we are using different kinds of approaches, right? Third of all, we say, the motion says it needs to be proven as effective. However, we think that in what happens then is that if you have to do these trials as NGOs and as a state, that means that you have these trials done, and that means that it's much more easy to compare which measures are more effective than others, right? So it's not just about is it effective or not, but sort of in the lengthening of that, in the pure logic of that, that means that the most effective trials are going to be compared to the other trials, which means that you have much less, reason or much less excuse not to do the most effective approach, which means that you're more likely to do that on our side of the house. Okay, so on to why we think this is a good thing to do. We say in the status quo, NGOs already have a lot of data, right? They already have a lot of ideas about what aid works well and what aid doesn't, right? Why? They've been doing it for years. Very often these are vested institutions that have been giving aid to specific areas for years. They've done a lot of research into what aid is the best. However, in the status quo, they aren't necessarily doing it in the best way. Why? First of all, we say very often there's a sort of vested idea or sort of approach that has been used for a very long time, that has been proven, for example, to be quite good by some academic that wrote a paper on how good that approach is, that has been used by that NGO and sort of been platformed by that NGO as the best approach for a long time, right? The moment that you as an NGO suddenly say, oh, wait, guys, we don't think this is actually the most effective approach, we're going towards a different one, you tend to think that you're going to lose credibility in comparison to other NGOs, right? Which means that your NGO is less popular than the other ones. That means that NGOs are very unlikely to be critical of their own approaches, because as long as they have some sort of result to show to the public, they're most likely to be the most popular NGO. Second of all, we say it's very much closely lied in with political incentives, right? So for example, very often NGOs have backing from certain politicians, have politicians that endorse them, but also work together with politicians who are in turn often affected by companies' interests, for example, by lobbying, but also simply by having certain interests, for example, more neoliberal interests or more leftist interests, etc., right? The politicians want to use those NGOs as a platform to show that they're doing good for the world. Therefore, the kind of aid that is given is not necessarily based on what is best for those areas, but it is based on those political frameworks in which that aid is given, right? So we say, for example, a moment that a politician works is more on the right-wing spectrum and has a lot of ties to, for example, companies, they're more likely to say work together with NGOs to spend money on infrastructure towards a company, and for example, spend money on irrigation systems for people that are working on the land, or spend money, for example, on better seeds, because for example, in the EU, they want to protect their agriculture sector, which means that they're much less likely, for example, to spend a lot of money on improving the agriculture sector in those countries, but they're more likely, for example, to say, well, we're going to give you our trademark pesticides so you can use them over there. However, that money is still going towards us. So we say it's not necessarily the best development. It is affected by all these kind of interests, right? What happens now? We say, first of all, because of the fact that they have to do these trials, every single NGO, they no longer have that sort of incentive to not look for the best approach or to kind of shoot themselves in the foot, right? Because everybody has to take this approach from now on. That means that it is no longer true that you, oh, sorry, I wasn't looking at the chat. PYCO in a second. You no longer have that, right? We say, second of all, because you have the most effective measures for development, you have a better basis for development, right? So for example, it won't be anymore just random things being thrown in random regions, but that you start to form an actual basis for development and start to work up that step by step, right? So we say it's much more likely that in a utilitarian aspect, the aid is actually going in the most effective way to these kind of countries, to these kind of regions, which makes them much better off. PY from CO?
Yeah, can you describe the process, resources, and time needed to do an RCT that tests the effectiveness of infrastructure?
So it might cost some money, it might cost some time. We don't really care because we think in the end, on the way off, if we have these, like the thing is with research, first of all, it's not very hard to do, just like you're applying a treatment anyway, right? So you're going to do that. What you do is just not apply it to one group and do apply it to a different group. It's not very hard to test the difference of that. Also, it's already being done in the status quo and in the motion. But third of all, we think even if it costs a bit of time and about a bit of money, it weighs off against all of the future what is it called, benefits that we get, right? Because we have a much better idea what kind of aid needs to be spent where, how that aid needs to be spent, but also after a while, these kind of you have these kind of interventions and these kind of treatments become much easier and much cheaper to do, right? We think with scale advantages, with experience, etc. That shouldn't be a huge problem. Okay, on to why this makes aid more credible. So we say what happens in the status quo very often is that there's a lot of criticism on aid in general, right? Very often people in Western countries think, oh, my aid isn't doing anything because people are still poor. Oh, maybe they built one well. I don't care. Why aren't they doing a good thing, right? Very often politicians try to use sort of this kind of narrative as well to say, oh, we're supporting the good charity. However, now because they have to do these kind of investments, these kind of treatments, they can use that as a framework to show people that it's actually objectively working and it doesn't have to be politicized, right? It's a neutral way of showing the entire population that the aid that they are donating towards NGOs is actually going towards the place that is good, that is the best, without it being politicized by political interests and being used in order to manipulate the electorate, right? So we say that people are, first of all, simply more likely to actually want to donate to these NGOs because they believe the approach is working. But second of all, we believe that because it isn't being politicized as much, we believe that they are much more likely to donate to the most effective approach as well, right? To the kind of NGO that they believe is the most effective, that is proven to be the most effective, right? So we say that is much better on our side of the house. So how does this weigh off, right? First of all, we explain that in the end, the best amount of aid is being given to the best amount of places, right? We say, even if they, for example, argue, oh, but it's not very nice to, for example, do a control group that doesn't get any aid versus one that does get any aid. We say, in the end, we're going to get better aid to a lot more places. Second of all, we say the depoliticization of this kind of aid means it's much more likely in the future, when this becomes absolutely normalized, it's much more likely to become based on the idea of where it's working the best, what it's actually doing, and what is best for those people themselves. Third of all, we say more people are likely to donate to NGOs because they think that it is actually working. Say that means that there's more money actually going to these places, which is a benefit in itself. We therefore say, because of all of these reasons, vote OG.
Thank you very much for that speech. And to open the opposition side, we are very proud to call upon the leader of opposition.
Hi, can everybody hear me? Fabulous. Three things in my speech. Firstly, I'll start on telling you what the comparative is. What is our counterprop? What do we support on our side? Secondly, I'll tell you why RCT is an inefficient metric via which we should allocate this money, and therefore what OG has to stand behind is a waste of money that is only going to decrease the amount of funding that they can claim to protect. And lastly, I'll go through the comparative. Why don't the things that we stand behind suffer from the same things? Cool. So what is actually the comparative? Opening governments used a comparative like politicians, but I have no idea why that's how they build their arguments, because they seem to be like unaware that there are other types of research that are not quantitative and that are actually qualitative, which is what we stand behind. So on our side, what we want is we want a mixture of quantitative and qualitative methods that go to inform where this funding takes place. Qualitative methods of research include looking at historical data, so stuff that has been implemented in the past and how populations have reacted on it, consulting with like local like experts, regional experts that have like been to those places, that have like interacted with the population, that are aware of things such as cultural factors, such as religious factors that are likely to influence the way in which these things play out. I think that that is very important to have a mix between the two. Note also that we do not have to stand behind like no RCT ever being proven. I think that a mix between them is going to be the most efficient thing, as I'll prove in my speech starting now. So why is RCT absolutely inefficient? Firstly, there isn't currently RCT data on most development interventions, and there isn't likely to be any like new in the future. Why is this true? Firstly, the best data that is, so firstly, because it's massively expensive to get. The best data that you can get on RCT is not stuff that is done in a lab, but that is stuff that is done on the ground. The reason for this is simple, because at the moment where your like research participants are in a lab, they automatically change the way that they would behave normally. They know that they're being watched, and they know that their actions are under scrutiny, and they're going to like show something about a certain population. Therefore, they're less likely to act as if they would like in their normal lives. Also, your lab experiment can just physically not capture the type of noise that exists in the real world. So I think what this means is that they have to stand behind, if they want any sort of efficiency on their side, to stand behind experiments done on ground, where like you like persuade a politician to change their tax base, whatever. Why is this problematic? Firstly, so this is extraordinarily expensive to do at the moment where you have to build an entire infrastructure to reach people in certain scenarios, where you actually have to like build the experiment before you can test whether or not it is efficacious. Like see the way in which like, you know, you have to build infrastructure to see if that infrastructure works, right? So then that takes a massive amount of money just to do the experiment, and it could end up being true that the experiment is just false. And you could have known this if you would have read a paper that told you that historically they tried doing this and it didn't work. Secondly, I think this requires massive political capital. I think this requires cooperation with leaders on ground for them to allow you to pass certain bills that mean that you like change the tax code, for example, to allow more FDI coming into the country, etc. I think this is very unlikely to happen for a few reasons. One, because a lot, or if we're talking about developing countries, I think they're likely to see these types of interventions as being intrusive on their populations, specifically, or like both if they're democratically elected and therefore they have to represent the will of the people, and if they're authoritarian. But secondly, I think that it's much more likely that they're going to perceive this as risky, because again, if they have to represent a group of people or have to provide security for a group of people in case of authoritarian leaders, they face political costs at the moment where they change their legislature to something they wouldn't have done naturally. So I think you have to have that huge persuasive material, again, for a gamble, right? For something that is uncertain, that is going to pan out. I think that opening government have a burden to prove to you that either this research already exists, which it sounds like it doesn't, or if it's going to increase, it's going to increase fast enough to account for the possible mistakes that they're going to do while waiting for it to increase. Why is this so terrible in terms of lack of research? Firstly, there is very little replication of the studies that you have. That means that it is less likely that those studies are generalizable. That means that it is less likely that those studies apply over borders. They apply in different cultural contexts. Note also, second, not only is this like a money issue, but it is a structural issue as well. Western academia, which is disproportionately likely to make these studies because that's where the money ends up being, that is where the resources end up being centered in Western universities, are also disproportionately likely to use like Western populations as their sample sizes. Firstly, because it is cheaper, but also secondly, because they lack a lot of times the cultural awareness of differences that might exist between different cultures. That means that the studies that we already have, like regardless of like all the decades of racism that we've had previously, where old research is very likely to be culturally insensitive because of these factors. So I think all the studies that we have, not very likely to be replicable. And even the ones that we do in the future are not likely to be very culturally customized. Before I go on, can I have a POI from closing?
Yes, so look, it's 2020. Your comparison of quantitative studies done by some historians in a lawn chair have to be compared to acquiring data via smartphones, via digital methods. It's not like we're in the 1970s where getting data from the ground is super expensive.
No, look, yeah, we're happy to concede that there are some increases, but that still doesn't account for the massive costs that you still have to do, both politically, because smartphones don't help politicians be more likely to pass the legislation you want to pass, but also in terms of like upfront costs. But I think lastly, and very importantly, I think there are decreasing marginal returns to any type of research, but particularly this research in this context. I think that the more you fund one type of research, or the more you look into one type of research, the more you're going down the line of quality of papers. We are very happy to fund the best of RCT trials, because again, we don't have to stand behind on our side like absolutely no RCT. So I think the more you go down on the quality level, the less effective these things are. I think that for when you look at looking at like qualitative methods, I think you're much more likely to get like culturally sensitive issues. I think you're much more likely to mitigate the generalization that you are likely to have under their side of the house, and at least you're going to get a diversification of funding that is much more likely to guarantee your success. We co-opt everything that opening government claimed to prove. Beg you to oppose.
Okay, thank you very much for this speech. And to continue that, the government side, I'm very proud to call upon the DPM.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, let me just set up the timer. Ready? This debate should be judged on three things. One, the price of initial, like the cost for initially beginning with development aid. Two, the chance of this funding, like even being allocated to a particular need. And three, the efficiency of how effective is this funding for actually changing and helping these people develop their lives. On all these three metrics, opening government is going to take this. First, on the price of the experiment. Notice a couple of very, very important things, right? Whenever we're talking about development aid, we're usually talking about projects that last years, often decades, in fact, multiple decades. If you look at the project done after World War II, most development projects happening all across Europe and in Southeast Asia lasted for 20, 30 plus years. And like this is the type of scale that is currently implemented as well. If you look at places like Rwanda, the post-genocide like development project has been lasting since for the last, what, 40 years or something? So in terms of understanding the scale, I think this is really important. Why do we say this? This is because largely projects once started are committed to. This is for several reasons. One, obviously the political capital. This is something that all will point out, right? This means that once you commit, you hire those particular workers. Once you like start investing, create those political like economic ties with particular companies, you know, hire people, create jobs. This is a political commitment that is very, very hard and expensive for you as a politician to back out of, because you've already like committed an enormous amount of resources. But also understand this is also like there's a massive opportunity cost against like changing something, even if you realize what you're doing is wrong, right? This is extremely, extremely important. Why? Because this means once you commit those millions, if not billions of dollars, they're spent. If they're inefficient, or if there was a more efficient way that you could have discovered with 1 more year of testing, or with 5 more years of testing, which again, in usual context is something shorter in terms of 1 to 3 years of like RTCing in a similar zone and like on a smaller scale, then you are significantly more likely to be spending, again, enormous, massive amounts of money that will be changing lives significantly more than the status quo. This is like really, really important because it really tackles down on the next issue, right? What is the likelihood of this particular set of funding even being allocated in the first place? And I think there's a few important things to understand. One, political and corporate interests, right? Because whenever you're talking about how this type of policy is passed, it's always passed by individuals. It's always passed by individuals with some sort of personal incentive. Something that Marike tells you that we've heard literally no engagement on. Understand that in the status quo, in order to pass your particular project, especially if you're if you're backed by enormous amounts of lobby, or you're backed by a country like China, which obviously like very, very heavily favors specifically its own economic and industrial interests, it is very likely that the projects that are going to be implemented are not going to be prioritizing the development and quality of life improvement in that particular country, but are going to be prioritizing the quality of life improvement of your industry, right? Especially like, again, if you include the massive amounts of corporate lobbying happening in the West and the literal like nationalization of many of the industries in the East. What does this mean? This means that it's very, very easy that you can just point out to some random academic, like elevate some existing research from somewhere that proves your point, and whatever measure you're thinking about, and whatever measure is the most beneficial for you is the most beneficial for the entire world. This is the issue with academics, right? Especially when they're dominated by mainly people who have never fucking visited the country, like by some Harvard professor who has written 20 papers on developing countries and has been to like two countries in Africa throughout their entire life. There's a massive disconnect between what the hypothetical might work and what in reality works. And it's a disconnect we're seeing with huge waste of resources. Just look back at the golden rice GMO projects in China, which was deemed to be one of the most expensive do-nothings of the last century, right? Again, billions of dollars thrown into very little utility efficiency. Why do we believe we should predominantly focus, especially for the mid and long-term projects, on projects that are specifically tested with RCTs? One is you guarantee at least a minimum amount of efficacy and return on this investment. What does this mean? This means that you eliminate many of the cases in which those corporate interests are prioritized over real policies. For example, if a specific country in Africa needs significantly better infrastructural improvement of irrigation, you can test that with a particular city as opposed to immediately just build a bunch of factories with your Chinese lobby pressuring the president to do so, right? This is the major delta, right? Every single change that we can prove scientifically is going to be beneficial in the long term, is going to be helping lives be improved in a significantly greater sense, even again, if it takes more time or if it takes more resources in the short term. But again, second point, allocation of funding. Do you actually persuade the people who are trying to give you development aid to, in the end of the day, fund it? I think you need to understand that those people often see such actions as investments of sorts, as investments with expected return, not now. As investment is expected return. This means you need to incentivize to prove to this person to some extent that he should commit massive amounts of money or more and more money in order to your project in order to receive certain effects. On one side, you have largely academic to some extent, maybe tested in one or two historic similar cases. But at the end of the day, you don't know exactly what's going to happen. The risk for your money being like completely defunct or being suboptimal is much higher when there is no scientific backing. This means that you as an individual or you as a corporation, you as a government are willing to give less money because again, there's lack of scientific proof. At the point at which there's a specific example you can refer to and you can say, okay, this and this are going to lead to an increase in the quality of life, in the quality of hygiene, in like the mortality rates of mothers, etc., etc. It is for you as an investor simply more comfortable to say, okay, I'm now going to commit these $5, $6, $7 billion with these specific expectations, right? This means you get significantly more money going into those countries in the first place. Closing? No? Opening?
So even assuming that all academics are equally racist, you are better able to call out the racism of people that write qualitative stuff rather than quantitative.
No. This is not about racism, right? It's about competency. This is about whether or not you are in touch, whether or not whatever you're doing is like the specific representation of what is actually going to happen in real life. The fact is most academics are just disconnected from reality because they've been living in academic circles, reading academic papers, and like not actually on the field doing the business stuff and seeing how like things pan out, especially when you talk about the things like noise and things like, oh, there's issues with the scientific method. Cool. The people who are most vulnerable to that are particularly the scientists who've been using those methods for years and years and years. I can talk about double-blind experiments and how you can like improve efficiency of RCTs enormously. But again, this is something I'm even willing to bite by saying, yes, even if it takes more years, it is much better to have a well-developed, a well-tested infrastructural project than have a half-assed one that wastes millions of money, millions of dollars that could be going on to solve and improving lives. So what do you have so far from opening government? One, you remove massive amounts of corrupt incentives that in generally reallocate resources to places where they should not be cannot be helping as much, but two are probably going for something they weren't intended for. This is like principally unjust, spending your money of donations to help some Chinese factory workers, some Chinese factory owner to make more and more billions. Two, you get significantly better testing in the long run. This means that whatever policy you come up with the commitments that it comes with, is going to be effective, or it's like going to be supported by those people and by its political system in a longer run, and it's not going to come with the massive amounts of potentially being a failure that comes with all the burdens of academics. And three, and most importantly, right, you get the fact that in the status quo, as compared to our world, significantly. Oh, time up? Okay, thank you.
For this speech, and to conclude the first half of this debate, we are very proud to call the DLO.
Okay, can everyone hear me? I think think opening government spends a disproportionate amount of their time fleshing out their impacts, which I do think are actually very big and very good impacts, such as getting more aid because politicians are more convinced, and therefore that gives more to, like, they give more to charities, or they endorse certain charities and pass bills and things like that. But notice that at the point that we prove that RTCs are not the best measurement of how good types of aid are, we get all of those impacts. I hope that you remember that while I'm doing this. So first of all, they talk about a lot of the stuff, and they concede in the status quo there is a lot of aid already, which isn't done largely by RTCs, because we already have tried and tested methods of how what we know works in certain areas, right? And I think that they say that, like, they then say that the efficacy of trying an RTC anyway is still good because you apply the treatment anyway, and if it doesn't work, well, some people have still got like some sort of good or something has happened. But the thing is, and I'll get onto like what the difference between qualitative and quantitative data is later, but notice the thing is that with an RTC, because it is quantitative within its nature, that if something goes wrong or it doesn't work for whatever reason, it is very difficult to know why that didn't work, because you've tried something and it's like either doesn't work, a yes or no. I mean, like, yeah, it can work to some extent, like it's to some extent on a scale, but like there's the difference between qualitative data, right? Because I think with this, when something went wrong, it's very difficult to know what went wrong. Why is this the case? I think it's because when you have like the alternatives, which as Julie fleshes out, is things like academics or people who've spent like their lives visiting these countries. I think that you're much more likely to like be able to track different things when you're doing things slowly and interviewing every member of a community about like what they feel on certain things or certain ideas being implemented in the community. It is more obvious to be like, oh, well, this didn't work because this group of people didn't like it because like it has certain religious concerns to them, or like they didn't buy this because like culturally they have never done things like that before. I think that is a lot more valuable and can tell you a lot more about where things go wrong or where things go right. I think they also, okay, back onto opening government, in their DLO, they then talk about why like when you have committed to this, you're like likely to follow through with this. I just don't understand why this is true, because I think if you commit to something and it starts to go wrong, I think if you have put billions of millions of dollars into it, as they claim, I think you're more likely to cut your losses. I think if it is not showing results quickly, this is you're unlikely to pursue it, because I think it is cheaper to cut your losses and then to, like they say themselves, you're less likely to invest an extra 5 years, and like sometimes the extra 5 years is what's needed. Again, that goes back to why it is bad, because it takes far too much time. Yeah, they also said the likelihood of being funded depends on like what corporations want and what they're willing to give their money to. I think to some extent this is true, but I'd also like to note two things. First of all, you have like more left-wing governments, like which in general tend to favor foreign development aid in general, and they are often not backed by a lot of companies. But secondly, we are talking about NGOs, which are like by principle the opposite of companies. Like there are loads of NGOs that people give money to just out of the goodness of their heart. But I also think corporations have other incentives, like just looking good. Like the reason that people buy fair trade chocolate despite it being more expensive is because people feel good about themselves. So I think corporations also have an incentive just to look like the good guys, because that is also what increases the amount of consumption that or what people consume from them. But they also talk about why academics are not the ones to do this or make these decisions. I think they are, though. They talk about the fact that these academics are stuck in this bubble and they don't understand the real impacts of what is going on. But I think like maybe this was true in like the 1940s or whatever, but I think this has become increasingly untrue with things like increased mobility and transport and trains and the increase on technology and globalization as a whole. It is easier and easier for you to get real dedicated researchers out into the field to interview people and to like look at or live and experience a culture for a vast number of years. I think this is happening more and more often, and so I think this falls on our side of the house a lot. Okay, cool. And they then talk about the fact that like the last thing they mention is that things like investments comes from when you, or like a political buy-in comes from when you prove the RTCs work. This is why I'm now going to go back onto what Julie said and how we went over them. Right, I think the thing is that like RTCs are not likely to work for a couple of reasons, and you're not likely to get buy-in for a couple of them as well. Okay, first of all, Julie already said the reason RCTs don't work is because like you have so many differences, like if that is historically or culturally or religious, like there's so many reasons why people will they will produce false results. For example, they did a test in, I think it was Bangladesh, it was somewhere in South Asia, where they tried a very certain type of like I think it was farming, and they tried to that worked very well. well in Southeast Asia, like using RCTs. They were like, right, so this is a scientific method which worked. And then they then tried to apply it to a place in Africa, and it failed miserably because of the lot of cultural differences. Even though the land was relatively similar, it was just not how people did things, and so it didn't work. Like, I think this is the problem. RCTs risk losing, like, wasting millions and millions of dollars and a vast amount of time. Julie also talks about the logistics, about the fact that these are, because they are so expensive to set up, because you need to go into the field, it takes a long time to plan these things, and so they are less likely to happen, which is also why you're less likely to have data on them right now, and even going into the future when you start them, it's going to take a lot of time for you to reap the benefits of this. I also think that, like, you're less likely to get political buy-in on their side, because because RCTs take so long to set up and plan and everything, you're less likely to reap results directly. Where even if you have like a slightly less efficient method, which we don't think is true, but even if you do believe that, but you get some results immediately, you're more likely to get political buy-in because they can see that. Because politicians just want to be elected for their next term, and if they can show that their policy or their foreign development policy has been working right now, rather than like taking 10 years to like reap the results of, they are more likely to buy into that and to give funding to that, which I think is also why it's more efficacious. I'll take a point from closing if they have one. Okay, I'll take opening.
Okay, so the idea that RTC trials and quantitative analysis is completely theory-free is simply ridiculous. You still use theory, you still use explanation to explain your results. The difference is that the conclusions are based on actual real-world work instead of just
at the same
talking.
time, because it is because RCT is more of a quantitative method, and what this means is that, like, you say, like, to what degree did this work? Like, out of a scale of 1 to 5, how well did this work in this area? But because you're doing, like, when you're trialing something and you have another group of people that don't trial it, you're saying, how did it work compared to them? You're not looking at the reasons why, you're just seeing if it works or not. You're not looking at the reasons why. But with qualitative data and like having academics in the field and things like that, I think you're much more likely to get more versatile data, which can be more easily applied when you know that the cultural factors are very similar in different areas, in a different area, right? Again, like, the other thing that Julie talks about is, like, you're less likely to have replication because, first of all, you have a generalized idea. You think this has worked in one developing country, it will work in all. But also the fact because academics and Western institutions tend to be more generalizing and homogenous and think like all of South Asia or all of sub-Saharan Africa is the same place. So that is another reason why it won't work. But also because Western populations will tend to use like Western cities and communities near them because it is cheaper and it is more efficient for them. And for all these reasons, they will not work, and I'm proud to oppose.
Okay, thank you very much for this speech. And to open the second half of this debate, I'm very proud to call the member of government.
Wonderful. So 2 things in my speech. First of all, why it is important that we do this whole process more scientific and that we make them A, better, and B, more fair. And second of all, I'm going to be talking more about the political buy-in, because opening up our government tried it, but didn't really impact it. So we're going to be doing it, but well. So first of all, a little bit of framing about about the whole thing. Like, first of all, we already gone the POI about like it's taking so much time. What is important to note that this debate is about foreign development aid. That means we're not talking about emergency aid. That means all of the situation where time is of the essence are not effectively within the debate. So if there's like a hurricane and we need to save people, that is not directly what we're talking about, because like that would be unfair and probably ungovernable. But second of all, development aid has been tried for decades. So opposition can't just come in and say like it's working so amazingly well, because the fact is that we have tried to say to give development aid to African countries for ages and ages, and it has never really worked in the first place. So it is very hard for opposition to just stand up and say, well, great things have happened, because sadly enough, great things have not yet happened with all of the things we do. But then third of all, on this point, we have seen that the current situation about how foreign aid has functioned is not something which is done very differently in different places. We see that the first response is to send rice to
any country, regardless of where they are in the world. So we see that this specific idea of like 4 and 8 in the current status quo is always literally the same for different places. So if opposition's debate is about like which place gives the most nuance, probably the track record of what foreign development aid has been so far is not the way that they want to be doing with. But then first of all, very importantly to note, like cultural and historical impacts are still going to be happening with us. Like when you make your trial groups, the different ones, you obviously want to have all of the different factors to play in, because otherwise your trial group is going to be failing. And this is an important thing to note. There's people who are running those trials have a very big incentive in order to make their trials function and the ideas that they are proposing to work in the end. So there's no reasons for them to not take in all of those things. So what we're basically saying is we can have all of the benefits of opening opposition, of taking in cultural and historical impact, and still have all of the benefits of what we are going to be bringing to you. So the comparison is not on one side we only look on data, and the other side we only look on all of the historical and stuff. The fact is we can do both. It's about the mechanism of how we are making the decision. So why it should be scientific in the first place. Number one, we generally believe that this is principally the best way of doing it, given that we're making it as objective as possible. We're not deciding on on all of the things, but it's been looking on as something as what we have to figure out instead of just something we have to do something in the first place. So this is a way of how we're actually objectively trying to be changing something. But second of all, we're taking out Western offices in the first place. And this is very important to note, that all of the things that opposition wants to be defending about, like having research and academics and all of the things we have lived in, we do see that especially a lot of the research who has done here there is number one, very much in the structures inherently racist, but second of all also shows a lot of historical problems about colonialism, but also racism within them. So what this is creating is that first of all, in order to actually be changing the system of how this has been doing, we do need to go out of the already driven in structures, given of how problematic they have been. So a swift to something more modern is definitely a swift shift to throw out all of this. But then third of all, science is inherently something where you look on the underlying issues significantly more than when you just are talking with people. Why? Because there's always some form of personal bias within the situation. There's very often the issue that you are not fully understanding everything which is happening. But once you want to be setting up this trial, you also are going to be interested in doing your previous research in order to be doing this. So what we're seeing is that with the foreign aid, some ways have worked. Therefore, you're not that interested in actually looking into the thing, because given opening opposition's analysis of it is quite expensive. So in order to actually have the incentive to do more research, to be changing those narratives, you also need to be putting on the different system within this. So what this is creating, in order for you to set it up, you're much more incentivized to look at the specifics within the situation, given that you know that the things need to be functioning differently, given that you have much different things to prove than previously said. But then first of all, the comparativeness within the situation, because once you look at it in the scientific ways, you number one need to know why it worked, and number two, you only need to also need to figure out what worked within the situation. What does this mean? In order, if you want to be finding out why your research group worked, it is important to note that this is just not just about that they worked, but in order to be like legitimizing the research you are doing, you also need to be figuring out within the situation of what has worked. What this is also going to be meaning, in order to figure out how your results were actually the way that you wanted to do, you are much more incentivized to be actually talking to the people on the ground in order to be doing this, because this is especially why there's this incentive to actually be talking to the people, as opening government has said that it is very opening opposition. Sorry, Nicola, that they are less likely to be like replicating them. They know that this is an issue. They know that replication, if it is going to be failing the things that they said, they are going to be liable for them because they said the trial worked. Therefore, they have their own name in the game. What this means is that you are much more likely to actually be talking to why it has worked, which is going to be including people. But then fifth of all, you are going to be dealing with your mistakes, because this is what I mean. If you do this research, you are with your name personally liable for this. This means you're significantly more interested in actually finding out what the reasons was, because if it is just about qualitative, as opposition wants to be defining, very often you just find justifications for why it fails and not the reasons of why your mistakes function. This sometimes can mean you have to spend more money, but we effectively believe that this especially means that you are more likely to do this. Very quickly on political buy-in, Ruben's going to make it better. So we have realized that we need a time to change, because this is important to note. The buy-in into the narrative that this is good to do, these need to help, unfortunately is declining with every million that is spent. And we see it especially with the rise of a lot of right-wing and a lot of rhetoric, where it is we don't need to help them, we have our own veterans in our country dying. So we see that there's just like the emotional buy-in just does not help anymore. Why is science the way of going there? Because number one, it is objective. Number two, people generally have like the scientific bias that once it is done scientifically, it is more objective, therefore better. We are changing the system in order to ensure that people actually go back into buying in order to have better research, in order to have more people, we back it to.
Thank you very much for this speech, and to open the second opposition side, I'm very proud to call the member of opposition.
Can you hear me? Great, just a second. Okay. So 3, 2, 1. We got from opening opposition why we want to do this RDC in an extensive way. We think it's true for some cases that we really want to do these RDCs, but we think there are also probably other cases where we will do this RDC and it's going to affect the incentives of funding and companies. We are going to show you how in these cases when we use this RDC, we are going to actively damage these places by first not dealing with urgent problems which are more important than effectiveness in the long term, and secondly, why we just kill the innovation and do less effective methods. But before I do that, one point of framing which is a little bit rebuttal, and the rest will be with the whip. So we think that we got from CG that there is no emergency aid that we are talking about. We're talking only about general things which are not emergency. But we really don't know what are the cases that she is talking about. The only example was hurricane and things like that. We can agree that this surprising disasters are maybe not in the debate, but we think that there are a lot of emergency things that are happening in the long term, which is exactly the things that these aids and NGOs are helping. Things like hunger in many countries around the world. Things like women abusement in Sudan and countries in Africa, which is a long-term thing. It's not a surprising disaster. Things like contributing nets against mosquitoes for countries in Africa, which makes people ill. We think that the most of the foreign aid is going to these emergency things. And if we took all of that out of the debate, we don't think anything is relevant here and is changing anything in the world. And if this is what government's protecting, they're probably protecting the less effective methods to aid developing countries. Now let's move to the argument and compare between the counterprop that we got, that it's the mostly mixture methods and mostly the RDC method. So first, I think we need to characterize a little bit how this mixture looks like, because even though opening opposition told us that this is the comparative, they didn't analyze how it looks like. So I think, yeah, we do extensive research, like they said, more expert history and not only the RDC. But we also think that sometimes these things contradict. Sometimes experts say to do A, this RDC saying to do B, and history saying doing C. We think it is reasonable that in these cases, they will fund all three of them in the first place, and as the time passes by, they will see what is the most effective during the way, and therefore move more money to this method. We think that therefore when governments are mostly mutually exclusive to RDC as the main method, we show you that we can start immediately few methods and then during the way change it. I'll do the way at the end, but we accept that maybe in the beginning will be less effective, but we will get to the effective one. during the time. So let's see the comparative here of the incentives of these NGOs. What is the method that they are doing, and we are contributing to that. We think there are two components that affect the incentives of this NGO. First of all, we think it's time. When the RTC is the main thing that they need to do in order to get funding, we think that they will need or to wait a really long time until they can actually start their aid, because they need to do this RTC time. And OG is saying that it takes 1 to 5 years and they don't care about it, especially when they're talking about trying method after method. And these things just take really long time and they won't even start to do it without this RTC. Second, we think that if there is already an RTC research that was proven to be effective, if they want a new one now, it will take really long time to start a new one because in the RTC. We think that in our side, we can start new things to get little less funding and prove it through time that it's better than get more and more funding in the long term, but to start it immediately, not wait these 3 years. Second, we think it takes a lot of money to do this RTC research, while to do it during the way is much less costly. Now, how it changes the incentives of these NGOs? We think, first of all, we think that new NGOs are going to enter the existing proven RTC methods. This is true because they don't have this time to do so, because they don't have the money to do so, and they will just enter the ones that already proven as RTC more effective. We think that, therefore, when there are new methods that can be more effective, that can be better, we think that just they are not being experimental in the first place, and we get less effective methods in the long term, which is something that is important to government. But second, we think that there is when there is new problems, we just think that it takes really long time to take care of them. We think that there are new problems that when they want this RTC, they will do the RTC because of all these incentives, and it will take 5 or 6 years until they actually start to deal with them. It's things like unemployment for women in Brazil that happens because of COVID-19. This is hunger in Venezuela that started in these few last years because it happens. And look, notice we can't take these RTCs from Africa about hunger because we think in Venezuela there are different criteria, like first I was saying, things like different politician situation, different government, and things like that. Therefore, we just think it takes really long time to start dealing with these new problems. Okay, so what we proved to you already before I talk about impact. First, that we just don't deal with new problems immediately, and it takes really long time until they even start. Secondly, we showed you that they're not going to start new methods in places where there is RTC already, and therefore lose these effective, more effective methods that can be more effective, and they won't even start it in the first place. Before I talk about impact, first house. Second.
Opening or closing, sorry?
Opening.
Okay. Governments and in general organizations are really, really stubborn and unwilling to try new stuff unless there's massive proofs that that new stuff works, right? You're just stuck with whatever old stuff you had, and you have significantly less incentives to try any of that new research.
Notice that in RTC, we only compare it to the control group, ones who didn't get anything. In order for them to compare between alternatives, we need to do once again and again and again, and it takes really, really long time. Therefore, I think that if they already proved that something is somewhat effective, they won't even try to do new methods that can be more effective when this one is already proven and you can get the money to do it and you don't need to wait so long. Now, let's talk about why we think that even if they get more effective in the long term, we think that the immediate problems are much more important for us in the debate. First, we think they are urgent problems that we need to deal with. Where I gave tons of examples in my speech. Things like new diseases in Africa and in the third world countries. Things like hunger in Venezuela. Things to get rooftop for places in countries. Secondly, you just think that people just think it's bare needs. People are currently dying from these things. Therefore, we think we need to first give these people something and not to wait that long time, especially when we're talking about the control group that gets nothing. And for all of these reasons, please oppose.
Thank you for this speech, and to sum up the government side, I'm very proud to call upon the government whip.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
But I just quickly set up the windows accordingly. Cool. Okay. Panel, Randomized control trials are the gold standard for medical research and also for medical research with political implementations, right? To find out what works best against coronavirus, everyone agrees that randomized control trials would give the best results. And this is, I think, the gist of the government case here, that randomized control trials are proven to be very effective in finding out which political measures can work to actually help people, right? Secondly, the status quo of development aid, and I want to make this very clear, is there are political decisions made based on soft factors in backrooms. It's actually people in the ministry deciding, oh, I think this sounds good. I've read a book here. We have some report by one person on the ground. It's actually very unclear on what works because it's hard to predict the future when the basis isn't data, but just some soft quantitative research alone, right? Thirdly, I do qualitative social science myself, and it has a high value. We are not against qualitative research, interviews, asking people, making arguments. We are saying it can be used very meaningfully to actually improve the qualitative research, right? What OO has to prove here is that it will become worse this way by combining both methods and focusing on the quantitative on the RCT side. Their argument says the qualitative methods is actually the best. The money should not be reallocated. I think this argument at this point is conclusively disproven because my partner has brought several reasons for why qualitative methods are actually superior. So we are saying there's no harm of using quantitative RCT methods, and we can use some qualitative stuff to make this actually better. An additional harm of just using RCTs is unproven from opposition, so this means OO is unpersuasive. The same is true for closing opposition, right? Closing opposition says RCTs take too long, we don't know what's working, but the problem is we have a non-working method right now, right? Billions have been wasted, and this is a proven fact. So saying that RCTs might not improve everything directly is not an argument against employing them, right? Saying that RCTs might not come up with the perfect idea directly is not an argument against employing them. That medical research hasn't solved coronavirus directly is not an argument against employing it, right? And they also say it's very unclear what could the aid be if it's not emergency. Development of infrastructure, development of schools, improving education projects, improving health resources. There's literally millions of projects that aren't just direct emergencies. Okay, so after this, what we bring, I think, on the first clash of the quality of research, what our opening here does is they are just throwing the word around, it's going to be more effective, and we agree. But my partner, Helena, alone gives you several reasons on why this is true, right? One of those reasons is because there's a unique culture of liability in quantitative RCT research. That means there's a peer review process, right? That means that scientists actually stand in for the truths of their results, and there's very easy data to verify who's right and not, right? Being right or not, it's not a debate between cultural scientists and historians where you have to read thousands of pages to find out who might be more persuasive. It's very simple. You make a scientific study and say, we predict this effect A is going to occur. And if the effect doesn't occur, then your study has a problem. That's very easy to see, right? There are reasons in the scientific culture, reasons have to be given that are mathematical, right? A lot of factors have to be factored in for something to work. Actually, quantitative research is quite difficult to make, right? A lot of soft factors have to be converted into data. And during this, a lot of attention will be given to very fine details that will escape purely qualitative research, right? This is we alone prove why this actually works, the more effectivity, and thereby take that point, right? On the second clash, the effect in the donor countries. What we actually show in extension is why the political buy-in, why the political effect actually works. What OG here says, apart from them saying it's hard to change projects, which is true for very big projects, but there are also a lot of small development projects, they say people just dislike ineffectivity. That's true, yeah, but the narrative goes way deeper, and we alone bring that. What we say is people are currently in a situation where the narrative is they are tired of spending money on somewhere else. They are saying we should be first. This is more and more popular in all over Eastern Europe, over the Americas, and also over Western Europe, right? The point is, what motivates them to donate and find tax donations acceptable to RCTs is one factor that we uniquely bring, and that is the tangibility, right? The point is, how do right now NGOs advertise? They're saying, look, this is a suffering person. If you click this button on your smartphone and give money to the UN, this person now has food. This is very tangible, and this will convince even people who think we shouldn't waste more money on African warlords, which they are frankly sometimes right about because billions have been misspent. So what RCTs uniquely do, as we analyze, they're very clear on what they are trying to solve. This is our problem. These are our methods. This is the result we expect. And when they get the result, this is something that they can easily advertise and put in the narrative, right? Even conservative Eastern Europeans will understand this tangibility. I think a lot of people who disagree with development aid right now agree with the scientific methods, agree with methods used in engineering, agree that something like doing a control trial and finding out what works and isn't is sensible, right? People do the same on a small scale in their own households even. They are trying to make a control trial they're testing different cars and finding out which works best. This is something that's very easy to explain. And this is material that we uniquely bring and show why this is actually capable on taking the narrative in our way, on showing that it's okay to spend some money on this, especially if it can be framed as preventing migration, right? All of these factors, what they actually prove is that randomized control trials, due to the unique methods in science, right, are capable of changing the narrative to the extent that there's more willingness for donations to happen, there's more willingness for tax money to be spent, right? The third clash on which I want to elaborate, but before that, I'd like to take a PI from opening.
Okay, so the reason that RCTs work on pharmaceutical or coronavirus trials is because it's biological. Social intervention has an infinite amount of variables which are just not captured by RCTs.
If that were true, it were truly infinite, it would be impossible to do any sort of quantitative economics at all, which is frankly untrue. The point is, of course, it's difficult. We are not denying this is difficult research, but what we are saying is who's better equipped to factor in a huge multitude of factors, right? A team of scientists who are trained in their entire career to do exactly that, or a team of people who are trained in reading big books. I read big books myself. I'm not talking trash on that. I'm just saying you are better at factoring a complex amount of factors in, because of the culture of accountability and reasons giving. And this actually, on the third smaller clash, has an effect in the aid receiving countries, because they now get fairer and more scientific attention, right? I'm okay with the combination with interviews and qualitative methods, right? But the unique methods of data acquisition via smartphones, via a lot of sources that are available now, mean that RCTs uniquely have incentives to go in and find out what is the situation on the ground actually, to treat these people fairly, without bias and without any armchair methods, but to see, okay, we just want to be very hands-on. We want to give this to you and see whether it makes you live longer, live better, and have more education and whatnot, or not, right? And this is the methods we use, and we have to very carefully, because RCTs might be prone to failure, find out what are the difference between this ethnicity in country A and the other ethnicity. What are all of the difference? We have to list that and analyze that, and these incentives exist because otherwise the study would not work. So what we prove in this debate is why the effectivity is actually there, and take the effectivity point, and we prove why the effectivity makes more aid being given and is better and fairer to the countries in which the aid results. Please, vote for closing government.
And to conclude this debate, I'm very proud to call upon the whip of the government whip.
Can you hear me? Great. I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. Look, us in closing opposition stand behind a very basic principle. We think a vaccine, a treatment, a road is better than none at all for a long stretch of time. We think that none of government bench stood by their burden of proving that the difference in effectivity is so big that it is worth having people not have access to these urgent, important things for the length of time it takes to do the RCT trials. If I show you that they haven't proven that, and show you the great harms of what people not having access to urgent care is, we can win this debate. First, let's talk a little bit about, this is going to have 3 clashes: what happens to money, what happens to effectivity, and how long things take. Let's talk about money a second, right? Because we think that all of the groups in this debate just ignore the amount of money and resources that need to go into doing these RCT trials. They talk about all of the good things that happen when an RCT trial is statistically significant and you can find it, but they don't talk about how long it takes to do that. If any or all of the RCT trials you do actually find statistical significance or not, and if they don't find statistical significance, then you've just wasted a lot of money into doing a trial which was ineffective and you didn't gain anything from, and then you're just going to do it again because they've analyzed why when people get something in their head, they want to continue to do it. So you're just going to try and change small things and try to do the same kind of intervention over and over again until it becomes statistically significant, and you're going to waste a lot of money on that process. I think that even if they prove that some people will give more money, they have never proven that that is going to cover the cost of all the trials you need to do to prove the different forms of intervention are actually statistically significant enough in order to do them again, which means that at no point has anyone shown us that there is a really big difference in the amount of money people have going towards donations. So we think that this money question at the end of the day is just like unclear. We think we're going to end up with a similar amount of money at the end of the day to give to people, which is why the question of effectivity and time are actually more important. Now let's talk about effectivity because we think it's super important here, right? We think that OJ tell us that we're losing out on better ways to do things. And I think that in her analysis, PM's speech actually says, we already have things that are being good enough today. That's why we don't have an incentive to check why things are better, and that is a problem. We think that given that framing, it is really unclear why the difference is so big. We get no analysis on how much better doing these things are. We have no analysis on why it justifies things taking time, and we have no actual weighing of effectivity over time. On the other side, we have OO that say that there are other but more effective ways of doing things, but they get attacked on the fact that it is not mutually exclusive to those things, and that people are going to take into account theories and base their trials on like cultural norms and things that we know. So we think that is exactly where we come in, because we come in where we show you that the real mutually exclusive thing is the time the things take, and why, given that, we think time and giving people solutions now, even if they're not the most effective, is super important. And then one more example we got from OG is about one thing that failed in China. First of all, we think trials, RCT trials, scientific trials fail all the time, and then you're also wasting money, and that is not effective until you find the right thing. And two, that is literally one example as opposed to the examples of things we have shown you are effective today. Like giving someone a vaccine is effective in vaccinating them, even if it is not the most effective way of distribution. Giving someone food is still effective in giving them food and them not dying of hunger, even if it is not the most effective way of giving someone food. Giving someone a mosquito net and giving someone money directly is still helping them right now and effective in helping them, even if there was a slightly better way of doing that, and we don't know why the difference is so big that we need to prevent that from happening. Then comes CG and try to give us reasons on why things are actually more effective and what the actual statistical significance is, right? Most importantly, they try to explain to us why things are going to be fairer and less political about it, because we are now basing things off scientific things. First of all, scientific research can 100% be political, especially when we talk about these things needing funding and when we question who is going to fund the trials and which interventions are going to be funded in the first place. We think in order to get funding for these things, in order to get to get permission to do these things in different countries, you also have to be political and go to different people, and you still have to go through the same process. Second of all, they're kind of trying to have their cake and eat it too when they tell us that we can base these trials on cultural knowledge and talk to people on the ground and find out. And they even tell us we have to take into account the difference between different races in these countries. But then they tell us we can do that without also taking into account the bias of the people we're talking to and the racism of the people we're talking to. We think they can't have their cake and eat it too. And if they want to tell me why we can take these things into account and we can take the culture and knowledge of the people into account when doing things, we also take into account that they are biased and sometimes racist against each other, and we get those things. So really, at the end of the day, on effectivity, we don't think that side governments showed you enough of a difference in order to justify the harms that we showed you. Let's talk about what those harms actually are, because what we think we are talking about is not necessarily only infrastructure and agriculture, because we think those are things that is very difficult to do scientific trials on, because it is very hard to measure what the consequences of having a road in certain places for long stretches of time, and that's just going to take a really long time. So if anything, our harms are worse, but we think it's more likely to question on the distribution of vaccines and food and medicine and things like that. Before I continue and talk about the impacts, I will take closing.
What is important to note is that especially mosquito nets were one of the things that came into place with this mechanism. So what it is creating is that you give mosquito nets in addition to vaccines so that we can literally do both.
I really don't know why you're trying to prove that we wouldn't give mosquito nets if we didn't do random trials. What I think will happen is that we will not give certain people mosquito nets because we haven't yet found out if it is more statistically significant or less statistically significant to do it in a certain way or other way, and we need the control group, which is exactly what we're protecting on our side, to do things now, even if there might be a more effective way of doing them. I can't take any more POI's time. Even if there's a more effective way of doing them, because it's so important that people get them now, even if there is a more effective way of doing them. We think that these things are things like vaccines and food and things that are literally saving lives and able to make people's lives better right now in this moment, even if there was a slightly better way of doing things. We think when governments don't show you why this difference in effectivity is so great that we're literally going, is so great that it's worth it to prevent people from getting the treatments and things they need right now in order to save their life. Once they don't prove that, and we prove to you that even if it's less effective, giving someone a vaccine right now, giving someone food right now is literally saving their life and making their life that much better, we win this debate. And we think we're the ones who win this debate over OO because we don't think OO ever actively do that way, except spend a lot of their time explaining why RCTs won't work or are less good, and we explain what is mutually exclusive, and that is why we win the debate.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone again for this wonderful debate. I guess now you leave the room and we judge here.